Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining my session today. As the slide says, my name is Todd Golding, and I'm a partner solutions architect at AWS, and I'm part of a team that's called the SaaS Factory. And that team helps organizations that are in different stages of building or optimizing or delivering SaaS solutions on top of AWS. And after the years of working with these different SaaS organizations, we've really started to see some really common patterns or themes emerge from the different SaaS providers who are on their journey to a SaaS delivery model. And one of the patterns that have really sort of jumped out at us is this one where we see these organizations that have sort of what I'd call a classic software delivery model. They've got these applications they've built, they're delivering them sort of in a one-off fashion where they're either installed maybe on premises or in the cloud. But the key takeaway here is that these customers are generally potentially running different versions of the product. They may have customizations, and they may even be managing their own environments, or they may have sort of one-off management of each one of these environments. And this model certainly works for organizations, but it also we've seen that it really presents a challenge for them because now as they're trying to grow their businesses, each new incremental customer adds operational overhead, it adds cost challenges, and these organizations are really struggling with how to grow their businesses and really add new customers without adding all this sort of operational overhead. And this is where the appeal of SaaS has really been a big selling point for these different providers, right? So these organizations are very interested in saying, how can I take my existing application and my existing solution and essentially just move it wholesale to a SaaS delivery model and really get all the goodness of SaaS? How do I get now I can get the innovation, I can get the agility, the cost efficiency, a lot of the goodness that's the promise of a SaaS delivery model. But the challenge for these organizations is they also have to find a way to get there fast often. They're in a hurry to get there because they see other pressures working against them at the moment. So what we're going to really talk about today is a very specific solution we've built to try to address this scenario. And this is a new offering from the SaaS Factory team. It is called SaaS Boost, and you'll see more about SaaS Boost across reInvent. But the basic idea here is we've built this reference environment that tries to address this very specific problem of saying, take an existing solution, often a monolith or a legacy solution, and move it to a SaaS environment as fast as possible and really accelerate my journey as a customer. So in this session, we'll look at some of the moving parts of just what is SaaS Boost, and then we'll dig into the architecture of that environment so you get a better sense of what the moving parts of SaaS Boost are, how it works, and what the core concepts are. Now, this is a 300-level session, and we're certainly going to dig into architecture, but we're not going to be like writing code in here or opening an IDE, those bits that we might typically get into in a 400 session. I'd also say there's another SaaS Boost session that will accompany this one that will go deeper into the underlying implementation. But hopefully here you'll come away from this experience with a good sense of what SaaS Boost is about and how or if it might apply to your environment. Now, before we can dig into the sort of the details of SaaS Boost, if you will, we need to step back and look a little bit about what is the real challenge here. And I've sort of described this a little bit, but I want to poke at this a little bit more so you get a better sense of what we're really trying to achieve with SaaS Boost. So if you look here at the left-hand side of this diagram, you'll see the sort of classic application environment model, right? Where we've built a product and what I call installed software somewhere where customers have installed it into their environment, or they've installed it somewhere in the cloud, and you'll see that they're running different versions. They probably have sometimes localized customizations, and you'll see each one sort of may have its own management and operations footprint. And this is a model that is very common for organizations, and it's helpful when you're potentially trying to get off the ground and really trying to accommodate all the unique needs of each customer. But you can also see how this can become stifling for an organization, right? It's really hard to then begin to innovate fast over here on the left-hand side. What does it mean to release new features and functions? What does it mean to address bugs or issues as they come up? If all these customers have customizations and they have different environments, it's very hard to have any sort of universal strategy. And this is the thing that sort of stifles these organizations. They have to sort of address all of these needs in a one-off fashion. And what they want from us is they come to us and say to us, is there some easy way we can essentially take what we run today, take our application as it is, and offer it to the market as a SaaS solution. So here you'll see the idea here is to basically say, take my existing application, move it over to this diagram you see on the right-hand side, and essentially deliver it to the market as a SaaS offering. And so this is exactly what we're targeting with SaaS Boost, right? Which is to say, well, we're going to provide you all the building blocks of a SaaS environment, all the sort of fundamental mechanisms and services and capabilities you need to run and operate a SaaS business without having to go do all the heavy lifting of building all of that yourself. You'll simply move your application into this environment and then get the goodness of SaaS Boost here to close all those gaps and provide all those mechanisms that you'd have to build on your own. And that's to us, we think will be a very compelling proposition for some organizations who are really feeling the struggle and this need to get to SaaS. Now, the dilemma here that is the business dilemma that many face here when they think about how to approach this problem is a pretty classic sort of dilemma, right? So if we look at organizations that want to go through this transformation, the approach they often take here is either one of two approaches. So at the top here, you'll see this approach that I've shown, which is maybe more of a classic refactor, modernize sort of path, which is to say, we have an existing monolith, we want to get to a modernized architecture, we're going to refactor, rewrite our solution, build this new SaaS offering or at least refactored SaaS offering, and then offer that to the market. And in that model, we certainly get a more modernized solution faster. But as part of this, we're also delayed in terms of our ability to sell this offering to our customers, right? We can't engage customers and start to offer them a SaaS solution until we've finished this entire rewriting exercise. And so what we're really trying to do here is find a strategy, find an approach that will let us get to SaaS faster and not absorb all of this overhead of rewrite and refactor. And the real challenge of this rewrite refactor model is that it really, from the time we start it to the time we deliver it, we have all this time during which we have no feedback from our customers potentially, and we also have the reality that the market could shift while we're in there. So that's sort of the risk of this model, is that you're sort of presuming that nothing will change as you go along here. Now, I will say this is a perfectly valid model, and for some organizations, especially if you're going after a new market segment or something, perfectly valid. You just have to sort of accept some of the realities that come with it. Now, the alternate approach is one where we say, let's, instead of sort of refactor, rewrite, and build the whole thing from scratch again, potentially, let's go ahead instead and let's migrate our existing solution into what we call a silo SaaS model. And I'll explain what I mean by the silo SaaS model here in a moment, but essentially into a SaaS offering and begin to offer it to the market as quickly as possible. And this is the sweet spot of SaaS Boost, right? We're saying we want to get you to that moment where you can sell as soon as you possibly can. And now, once you're offering to the market, we'll give you the option of incrementally modernizing your solution. So now you can step back, you're selling in a SaaS model, and you can ask yourself, what architectural changes do I need to make? What sort of incremental enhancements can I make? But this really reduces the pressure of getting to market and reduces some of maybe the compromises you might make in your architecture because you're in such a hurry to get to SaaS. So for us in general, even in any model with or without SaaS Boost, we always prefer an incremental path to SaaS. Just because we feel like this really gets you engaging customers sooner and really allows you to get feedback from the customers integrated into your development process. So what is SaaS Boost? Like, what are the moving parts of SaaS Boost? Well, SaaS Boost is what we would call an open source reference environment, right? Basically, what we've done is we've built all these components of a SaaS environment. We've put them up into a repository, and then we're making them available to the community to be able to say, pick and choose the flavor of experience with SaaS Boost that is best for you, right? If you want to just move your application in and immediately try to get to market as soon as possible, certainly go with that path, and that's a perfectly valid path. Or for others, maybe it means bring SaaS Boost down to your environment and now customize or change the environment to match what you need to be here. So we don't really, any one of those sort of variations is certainly valid, But what you'll see here in SaaS Boost is we've really introduced the core building blocks of the experience. So you'll see we have metering and billing, for example, here. Something totally sort of incremental to your traditional system is often needed here to handle all the unique ways that you want to bill in a SaaS model. We've introduced operational bits here that are about how to do tenant-aware operations and how to do all the DevOps bits that are critical to deploying and operating a multi-tenant SaaS environment. We've introduced onboarding here to automate all the moving parts of onboarding and deploying applications to your tenants in a multi-tenant environment. So we've really tried to just pick and choose all those horizontal concepts, package them up in an offering, and then release that for all of you to go out and then begin to see how can you use this to accelerate your path to SaaS. And so we also want to sort of highlight the fact that this is really the first step in a journey for us, right? SaaS Boost version 1 has a lot of capabilities that are about this sort of accelerated path to SaaS. It has all the mechanisms needed to support this lift and shift motion, if you will. It uses a siloed SaaS model where each tenant essentially gets their own stack, and that's used to sort of simplify the ability to move a monolith into this environment. It has all the onboarding automation, supports Windows and Linux. It has this notion of extensions, and these extensions essentially allow you to configure additional resources that are needed as part of your environment, as billing and metrics integration, all the things I sort of talked about as part of the components. But these are just the baseline version 1 flavor of this. We really imagine that there's lots of ways that we can enhance this experience. And this is why open source is such a huge part of this. This is why we're on the open source track at reInvent, which is we really want the community to get engaged with us and really look at what we've built, engage with us as a community, and help us figure out where is the right direction to take this? What are the features and capabilities we need to add to SaaS Boost to make it address additional use cases and scenarios that we may not be covering today. And you can see even here on the right-hand side, we've already got a roadmap and a vision for where we want it to go. We want to support pooled model with shared infrastructure. We want new extensions added. We want a much richer operational experience than we have now. We have lots of things on the backlog that we really want to introduce, but we'd like to introduce them alongside all the feedback we have from the community, or even the contributions that the community might make to this experience. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop of what SaaS Boost is, why we're using it, what's its importance. But let's now look at what's the high-level experience here. And I want to emphasize that SaaS Boost isn't an AWS service. SaaS Boost is a downloadable open source solution. And as you see the moving parts of it here, you'll see how that comes together. But essentially, the experience starts with a repository that is the repository where all the SaaS Boost constructs are stored, and the code and all the bits you're going to need. And then as a developer here, whether you're an ISV developer or just a consultant or whoever wants to consume SaaS Boost, you will download SaaS Boost to your environment, and then you will provision a SaaS Boost environment. So there's an install process, and there's documentation that will help you along this path that will help you through the setup and the installation of your first SaaS Boost environment. And this will provision all the infrastructure, all the horizontal services, all those building blocks that we referenced in the earlier slides. Once you have this working, and you'll see that this is provisioned to your own AWS account, then the next step in this process is really to go away and configure the actual application environment. So here we're going to go away and tell it the specific things about our application that need to be configured. What's its domain? What's the compute set of it? What's the billing integration? All those bits that are unique to your application that tell us how your app has to be configured in this environment. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But the other piece of the puzzle that we have to have here is your actual application. And what we've done here is said, take your existing build process. So if you've got Jenkins or TeamCity, or you have some script you run to build your environment, and take the artifact that comes out of that build process and generate a containerized image of your application. And we have examples. We'll show you kind of what tooling and other bits are available. Windows and Linux, for example, have different approaches to containerizing here. But ultimately here, we want you to build a containerized version of your application and publish that containerized image up to SaaS Boost. So you're going to upload that essentially to a repository inside of SaaS Boost. And now when that's there, we have your application. We know how it needs to be configured because we did that in the prior step. The next thing we really have to do here is just begin to provision tenants. So the idea is that we can now begin to introduce new tenants into our environment in a multi-tenant fashion. So now as tenants onboard in this environment, we'll actually provision them. You can provision them straight from an application that comes with SaaS Boost, or we'll look at another way that you can do that as well. But ultimately, when we provision a new tenant, we're going to create all the infrastructure, all the configuration, do all the automation that's needed here to create a new tenant in your environment. And this new tenant is going to have all the bits you need to run your application. It will have the application itself running. And now, as you want to add 10 more tenants, 100 more tenants, you just run this exact same process over and over again, and there's no moving parts for you. It's just provision a new tenant, and all the automation is there, including if you have updates to your application. Say you upload a new version of the container image for your application. That too would just get deployed to all the tenants that you provision in your system. So we really address both the onboarding and the deployment dimensions of this problem. Finally, when this environment's all up and running, you still need to be able to manage it. And we talk a lot about the importance of multi-tenant management and having views into tenant activity and how tenants are consuming resources, what trends there are with tenants. And so we've baked some of that into SaaS Boost as well, so that you can sort of analyze and monitor and potentially introduce configuration changes to your environment based on trends you're seeing with different tenants. But this is sort of the end-to-end experience of the SaaS Boost environment. It's pretty straightforward. Get it, install it, upload your app, configure the app, and then begin provisioning tenants. And if you're in a low-touch mode where you're just trying to get it working, there's no code for you to write here. All right, this is all just running commands, running the application. It's all point-and-click sort of bits. Obviously, again, because we're open source here. If some parts of this you want to work differently, you're certainly free to sort of step into the code and change the way some of this automation might work. So we talked about the provisioning of the infrastructure and the provisioning of the SaaS Boost environment, but I thought it'd be helpful to also show you what actually gets created when you run that install script. And if you look at this, you'll see that the SaaS Boost sort of services, these are the horizontal services that are common to your entire SaaS environment. Are the typical service you'd build, even if you were going to go away and build a SaaS solution entirely on your own, right? When we work with SaaS providers, these are many of the services we help them build, right? How do you build a good onboarding process? How do you have centralized tenant management? How do you manage users and identity inside your multi-tenant environment? And what we've really done is said we've taken those horizontal services, and these are now sort of the baseline services that are baked into to SaaS Boost. And they're all deployed in a serverless architecture model. So if you've seen serverless SaaS at all, this should look very familiar to you. We've essentially have each one of our microservices, which is a composite of a few Lambda functions. So onboarding, for example, is multiple Lambda functions. Metrics is multiple Lambda functions. And then these services are accessed via API gateway. And so that's sort of the REST API, if you will, of the SaaS Boost environment. And then there's an administration application. This isn't in the console. This is just a standalone application that gets installed and set up in your environment as part of Boost. And this is the application through which you configure the experience, and you can launch tenants, and you can see the operational views. And this application is written in a very classic React single-page application model. It's deployed to S3, uses CloudFront. All this is sort of classic sort of serverless SaaS web application development here. On the right-hand side, you will see some additional services that are part of SaaS Boost. And these are pulled out and sort of identified separately because they're areas that include integration with your application. So far, most of what we describe means zero touch to your application. However, these two other areas, billing and metrics, both require a little bit of work in your own application. We'll certainly do all the heavy lifting to get billing set up and to get metrics set up and to make onboarding, create a new account in the billing system. We do all that for you, but there is a point at which you have to tell us, what are the billing events of your system? What are you measuring? What are you billing on? And so this is where you have to go add integration to your system to publish those billing events. And we'll look at what that looks like a little bit. We also, as an organization, talk an awful lot about the importance of metrics in SaaS environments, and that's data about how tenants are consuming your environment. This is often very domain-specific bits. Yes, we have operational views built into SaaS Boost, but we also wanted to give you a way to publish your own custom metrics and aggregate those metrics and surface them in QuickSight so that you could sort of build dashboards that might be your product manager's view or your operations view of what's going on underneath the hood of SaaS Boost. And obviously, metrics also requires a little bit of work on your own application's part to instrument those bits into your application. Finally, you'll see the application also has, your application would also have potentially integration with the API gateway into these backend services of SaaS Boost, depending on what features and capabilities you put into your application. So if onboarding, for example, was baked into your application and not triggered by SaaS Boost, then this is a place at which you would call the API of SaaS Boost to trigger that onboarding process. Now, in terms of configuration, the configuration is really pretty straightforward. You're telling us, again, everything you need to set up the specifics of your environment. So there's sort of a global set of settings, and then there's some specific tenant configuration. But you're going to tell us the domain, for example, that your application's running in, the subdomain, what compute resources it's going to have. We've done some work here to make selection of compute easier. So we have t-shirt sizing around compute. So instead of just looking at all the different AWS options, we've got like small, medium, large, extra large. So you don't have to like pick and choose exactly which one is the right fit for you. And then you'll also set up extensions, and extensions here are additional resources your application might need. As part of it, you can imagine if you're moving it over, yes, we can move the compute over and we'll move it over for you into AWS via this container mechanism. But then your application may have dependencies on a database or a file system or something else. And so what we've tried to do with SaaS Boost is pick some of those resources that we think would be really common for somebody moving, particularly from a monolithic environment into a SaaS model. So here you'll see support for SQL Server on the Windows side, for example, or you can actually use SQL Server from Windows or Linux, but specifically we have like Windows and Linux paths here. So you can choose which operating system you're deploying into, and then you can pick which extensions you have here. So EFS if for your file system, or FSX. We essentially take care of configuring and setting all that up and connecting it to the overall configuration of your application. And then we set up the Stripe, sort of the billing integration here, where we'll set up the API and all the other bits that need to be configured. And once you have all of this in place, you can then begin to start provisioning tenants. And then as you're provisioning tenants, you actually get additional options to override the defaults and assign potentially a tenant, for example, to a different tier that might give them different CPU sizing, things of that nature. Okay, so we've said silo SaaS and this lift and shift model. Like, what are these tenant environments that actually get provisioned look like under the hood? Like, what's the architecture of them, and what do we really mean by silo SaaS here? And so we're going to look at what this means, well, through the lens of these individual services that orchestrate this experience. So first, obviously, we're going to upload a containerized version of our app. We sort of talked about that bit, but that's certainly fundamental to get going here. And then we'll go into the admin app. We'll hit the settings microservice and the settings microservice to give it the settings of our environment. Then we'll onboard a tenant. And this is where you could onboard both from the admin application or your sign-up page. The key here is this is all being orchestrated by this onboarding microservice. And then the onboarding microservice will now provision a tenant environment. And here it will provision the full stack of that environment. So here's where the silo concept comes in. Each tenant will have their own stack. And that isn't unique to the SaaS Boost environment. We have customers all over in the SaaS universe who use a silo model based on domain or compliance or other needs, where they're still running a separate stack per tenant, but they're still operating in a SaaS model. They have a unified experience across all those tenants. So here we're still very much a SaaS solution. We're just running this variant of siloed SaaS to make it easier to move your monolith into this environment. So we provision the silo, we provision this tenant's infrastructure, we provision it into this shared environment. And here's a really key takeaway that's a difference from maybe the classic sort of model that your monolith might be coming from, which is each tenant environment we provision here is going to have the exact same infrastructure. It might be configured slightly different, but it's the same footprint. they're all also running the same version of the application. This is essential to moving from your classic environment to a SaaS environment. If we allow customers to have one-off versions or different flavors or different customizations, we start to undermine the entire value system of SaaS and multi-tenancy here, and our ability to innovate and move fast and get the operational efficiency that we're after. There's certainly downsides to this model in that it's not as cost efficient as you want, but it gives us a way to get to SaaS as quickly as possible. Obviously, after we've provisioned into this environment and set up all the infrastructure, there is a last step, which is we have to actually deploy your application to that environment. And now here, again, if we introduce a new version of the application, that would just get deployed to each one of the tenant environments as well. Now, the actual structure and the layout of these tenant environments is pretty straightforward. You'll see at the top of this diagram that we've essentially used Route 53 and subdomains to identify incoming tenants. So we have a tenant 1 and a tenant 2. They both come in. They both hit Route 53. And then they're routed to individual VPCs that are the VPCs for each tenant. So here, a VPC per tenant model, you'll see that they're multi-AZ so that we get the high availability bits. And then you'll see the compute resources of each tenant environment using ECS with Fargate. And here, again, the configuration of the cluster, depending on the tier of your tenant, might be slightly different, but the infrastructure will always be the same. So we're going to land that containerized image in here, run the compute of your environment in ECS. And then the last bit here at the bottom, you'll see database and file system. These are placeholders for the extensions that you'll introduce. And they're generic on purpose, right? I don't know, this could be a SQL Server database, it could be an Aurora database, it could be RDS, Postgres, it could be any one of these database flavors. And then the file system also could be FSX, EFS, whatever you've chosen here. And whether you have them or not sort of depends on how you've configured your application. But when you're all done, it's sort of the compute that's here, that's running in this VPC and this multi-AZ VPC connected to these extensions that really represents your entire tenant environment. And through Route 53, we've just dealt with all the goodness of making sure that they get routed to the appropriate stack. The billing integration piece of this, we felt was super fundamental to having a SaaS solution. We wanted to give everybody a head start. Of course, the challenge of building a billing solution that's a prescriptive billing solution is each billing provider has a slightly different solution. So what we've tried to do is pick a billing provider. In this case, we've picked Stripe as a starting point and acknowledge that there are lots of really good billing providers out there. Zuora, ChargeBee, FuseBill. There's a really long list of providers. You'd want to pick the one that's best for you. But if you're just looking for something turnkey, out of the box, ready to go, we happen to start with Stripe as the integration for SaaS Boost. And so here you can imagine swapping out Stripe for the thing that was meant for you, but hopefully we've sort of abstracted it away enough that won't be too large of an effort. So anytime you have a billing system, you're going to have to start by creating an account in that billing system. That's something you do on your own. Go sign up, get your account established with Stripe. And then out of that experience, also get an API key. That API key is key to our, no pun intended, to our integration with this experience. Once we've set that up, then we come over to SaaS Boost, go over to the admin application, go to the billing integration portion of this, and put in the API key. And when we put that API key in, that then triggers SaaS Boost going out, hitting Amazon EventBridge through our billing integration, sending a message to EventBridge to tell it, hey, we've configured a new environment here. Go out and set up the products. And the products in this case sort of represent the plans of your different SaaS environment. And this is sort of a Stripe connotation. Obviously, the terminology in different billing vendors will be slightly different. But this essentially sets up the fundamental bits that are needed to figure out how to onboard tenants in your environment and what plans will be available to those tenants. Now we can onboard a tenant. So we can come in, provision a tenant, go through the onboarding service. And of course, because we're onboarding a new tenant, we have to onboard a new customer into the billing system. So we'll, again, send a billing event over to EventBridge that says onboard a new tenant, and that will go out to Stripe. And as part of creating a new customer or account inside of Stripe for this tenant, we'll also get back a subscription ID that identifies the specific sort of subscription that's associated with this new customer. And we will store that in DynamoDB and another service that we have that holds all that billing information. Now, onboarding's the tenant's onboarded. We've got all the moving parts in place. The only thing that's left to do is have the application actually start publishing billing events. So now when the application publishes a billing event that tells us a tenant consumed some resource or they signed up a new user, whatever the sort of billing unit that you have is, the system will go out and look up your subscription ID for that tenant inside of DynamoDB and then publish that billing event to Stripe. And now Stripe is accumulating all these billing events and then can, at the end of the month or whatever your billing cycle is, send out the bill to your customers. So we think through the event bridge that we have here, we've at least hit away a little bit of the detail of what it means to integrate with billing. But certainly you would want to sort of dig into this and figure out which patterns are really going to work for your environment. The next piece we want to talk about here is the tenant-aware operational views. And I mentioned at the beginning that we've really, in the SaaS Factory team, pushed really hard for organization to say, build really rich views of tenant health into your operational experience. So yes, it's good. We should use CloudWatch, New Relic, App Dynamics, all those tools to build views of health. But you still need views of health that are very sort of tenant-centric, tenant-aware views of health. So show me what features are being consumed by a specific tenant. Show me how tenants are pushing load, and let me compare the way tenants are putting load onto my system. These are all questions I want to ask and have right at my fingertips. And so these are the pieces we've started to build into SaaS Boost. And we've built in dashboards and analytics dashboards that let you look at activity of tenants, CPU, memory, requests, paths that they're executing on the API, all through the lens of this tenant context, and including you can filter down to an individual tenant and just see what one tenant has been doing in your system. And we think this is an area where there's lots of opportunity for growth, but we wanted to sort of start with this foundation of this experience and then really start to add more and more sophisticated views, hopefully get more of you involved in helping us know what some of those views should be and how to make that more helpful in a broader context to the community. Okay, so I just want to sort of wrap up here with a few key takeaways that I think are really important as part of looking at what SaaS Boost is. First of all, you should know that the initial version of SaaS Boost is very much delivered in this siloed SaaS model. And that siloed SaaS model is really going to be good for people who are picking up and moving over monoliths, but it may not address everybody's need, right? If you're have a very specific architecture, you're very much into this this exotic microservices model, this may be an area where you'll have to dig into the code initially and make it sort of morph it into what you need it to be. Longer term, this is an area where we're going to evolve SaaS Boost and embrace more models, but we really thought this represented a really good starting point for a very specific theme and pattern we'd seen. Like I said, there is a roadmap out there. We're hoping you'll help us develop that roadmap. That calls out support for pooled models, multi-container models, new extensions, all kinds of new variations of ways to make SaaS Boost support a richer collection of SaaS use cases. We really, as part of this release of this, and I'll share the link with you in a moment, really think that you as a community are going to be in the best position to tell us what features and functions should be in that roadmap. And we really would like you to go to that page, sign up, get involved in our preview experience, and really start to engage our team and start providing feedback. And then ultimately, when this goes into the wild, we love commits and all the other things that come with with open source as to be part of that experience so that we can really have this be something that is built more widely by the community and not just by us. Ultimately, I feel like SaaS businesses need more prescriptive models. And I feel like SaaS Boost, and SaaS Boost is one of many. We have other things we're introducing as part of the SaaS Factory, but in general, SaaS organizations need more prescriptive guidance and more ready-to-use solutions. And we feel like SaaS Boost is the beginning of our efforts to try to provide those prescriptive solutions. Now, I did say there's a link here. This is the link to SaaS Boost. This will take you out to a page where you can get more information about SaaS Boost and how to sign up for the preview and how to get more engaged in that community process. I definitely encourage you to go out there, sign up, and discover and find out whether or not this is a good fit for your particular application. And then I also just wanted to highlight the fact that there are more sessions going on here. Like I said, there's another session, GPS 304, that'll come up that will be on more in-depth on SaaS Boost. We've got an EKS session that's coming that will be provide a reference architecture for EKS SaaS. There's a monolith to serverless SaaS, and we have a business session as well. So definitely encourage you to look at the other content. And if there's just generally you're looking for more SaaS content, I would hit up the SaaS Factory page. We have lots of reference content out there already today. So that wraps up our session. I hope SaaS Boost is appealing to you. We're hoping this really resonates with the SaaS community, and we're really looking forward to you signing up for the preview. So thank you so much for attending the session, and have a great conference.